The old world will soon vanish, wiped from history, to pave a path for the dawning of a new era. How many have been consumed so far? Were we the 10th civilization or the 1000th? Amusingly, they thought their small struggles were such great significance. All was not but to serve the void. The world of Rainworld was once dominated by one long-forgotten civilization. Everything we see and everything we do was influenced by these mysterious people, and they were known simply as the Ancients. There are so many different aspects and characteristics of the Ancients we could talk about first. Their history, their culture, where they even went, why we're even here, and so on. But before we even begin piecing together everything about them and understanding their story, I think it is important to first understand what this past civilization even looked like. It might be hard to imagine their story and history if we have no clue as to their appearance. But as you might already know, the Ancients left behind very few clues or records describing their appearance, and what they did leave behind as well, cryptic at best. This makes the appearance of the Ancients one of the most poorly understood and controversial aspects of them. So I figured we could sort of build them from the ground up, and review the evidence that we do have of their appearance, so that we can begin to characterize them. The first time you noticed any sort of depiction of them was probably the murals on top of 5 pebbles. We can also find the same ones on top of Looks to the Moon, and similar but unique portraits are found in Metropolis. From all these depictions, we can derive at least a few characteristics the Ancients would have had. For one, they were at least humanoid in appearance. They stood of 2 legs, they had 2 arms, and so on. Their biology is at least similar to ours. You may also notice how all of them are wearing masks, and that their faces are scratched out. They also wear very intricate and lavish clothing. All these are due to cultural reasons, which we'll talk about later. There are of course a lot of strange and unexplained characteristics of the Ancients. Some of them appear to have claws as feet, mangled arms, and even what looks like a tail. But besides these handful of murals, there are actually more depictions that we can use to see what they looked like. Throughout the different regions, we can find hundreds of different graffiti drawings. Most are either irrelevant, too abstract, or indecipherable, but there are a few that give us more clues as to the Ancients' appearance. The most notable of them being Bubble Devil, Pilot Helmet, Big White Eyes, Gas Mask, 4 Eyes, Sitting Man, Critic, and finally, Boxbird. While these depictions are, well, abstract to say the least, we can see characteristics we would associate with humans, but also many strange and disturbing characteristics a human wouldn't have. The most detailed or realistic look we get of one of the Ancients is while we're exploring Metropolis as Artificer. 5 Pebbles as Overseers can be seen occasionally projecting advertisements throughout the abandoned city. One of these advertisements shows an Ancient standing next to their own Citizen ID drone. They appear to be crossing their arms, and you might be able to make out their hand. On another note, we might be able to make an educated guess on how tall the Ancients were, relative to the Slugcats. Using references such as the ladders, hallways, and an elevator cab, I think it is fair to say that the Ancients were about 2 to 3 times taller than a Slugcat, if not slightly taller. But besides this, let's do a quick recap. These ancient beings were very human-like in appearance, or in other words, they seem to be anthropoids. They had faces similar to ours, They often had humanoid feet, arms, and hands. On the other hand, we can see some strange patterns in their appearance. Their digits are especially inconsistent. Some have 5, 4, or even 3 fingers. Many have none at all, their arms or legs simply ending at a single point. Some have feet that are massively disfigured, to the point where they appear to have claws. One depiction shows an ancient with a tail. The overarching theme in these weird characteristics is that of bird-like traits. In fact, the most widely accepted theory on the ancients' appearance is that they were an avian-like species, a mixture of bird and human-like characteristics. This would explain their bird-like appendages, tails, and even their long beak-like masks. But then again, many of them clearly did not share these same characteristics. They had more human-like than bird-like traits. This leads to a second theory that maybe the ancients had two sort of species, one that resembled more closely to humans, and one that was more avian and bird-like in appearance. Another theory suggests that the ancients practiced some sort of foot binding, which is an old Chinese practice of disfiguring and twisting your feet in other desired shapes. In other words, maybe the ancients sort of twisted their limbs into these disfigured and inhuman shapes. Their limbs are often wrapped in what is presumably some sort of cloth, suggesting they could be pressing or molding them. What's interesting about this theory is that the ancients had many ties to that of Asian culture, and some sort of foot binding could be a part of that, but we'll talk more about their culture later on. Maybe they applied some sort of biological engineering or genetic modification to themselves, since they definitely had the technological capability of doing so later on. If they could engineer new types of fauna, they could probably modify themselves too. But again, more on this later. In reality, it's probably a combination of these theories that explains their strange appearance. Sadly, the ancients are long gone by the time we play as any of the Slugcats. We will never get to see one alive, so we may never be truly certain of what they looked like. Before we get into all of their history, there are a few things about the ancients that are worth clarifying. You see, the ancients had many unique cultural beliefs and practices that could be easily misunderstood or misinterpreted. Essentially, a lot of what they did might not make any sense without any context. The first thing I want to explain that I briefly referenced before was how they were always seen wearing a mask, or how they scratched out their faces. This can be easily explained by their culture. It was considered to be a cultural taboo in their society to show your face, or not wear a mask no matter who you were. In ancient times, the masks were actually about showing spiritual persuasion, covering the face as a way to symbolically abate the self. And, at least later on, it also served as a form of expression of identity. Another thing you may have noticed was their strange naming convention. As you can see, from all the confirmed names of past ancients we do know of, they all seem to have what looked more like phrases than names. We don't know exactly why they gave themselves these kinds of names, it was just sort of how they did it. For the most part, they followed a simple convention of an amount, followed by a noun. So for example, if you wanted to create your own ancient name, it could be something like 1 Nissan Altima, 14 outstanding tickets, or a Redditor, 0 showers. Lastly, I mentioned earlier how the ancients seem to have close ties to Asian culture. We can mainly see this in their language and spiritual beliefs. Focusing first on their language, their actual written language is mostly indecipherable and impossible to translate. However, some symbols may be a bit familiar or similar to other known languages. Many members of the community have already scrutinized and analyzed the ancients' language far better than I ever could. They found that the ancients' alphabet seems to have ties to Korean, Cyrillic, and Thai alphabets, and possibly connections to Japanese symbols. Their language was definitely also spoken, since we can hear the iterators talk to us in it. Lastly, I also thought it was worth mentioning that the ancients used terms such as dynasty to describe certain time periods. But now, let's focus more on their religion and spirituality. It was probably what shaped their society the most, and is the most important cultural aspect to pay attention to, since it can help you understand their actions and why they did what they did. In general, they had a very spiritualistic society. Their religion seemed to have many close ties to Buddhism, and shared similar principles with it. You see, from very early on, the ancients were not only aware of something known as the Great Cycle, but actively tried to break it. If you don't know what the Great Cycle is, it is a term coined by the ancients that describes a process that every living organism suffers from. In rainworld, every living being is trapped in a time loop or a cycle of death and rebirth, that every time you die, you will simply wake back up. Nobody, not even the ancients, could truly ever die. Death isn't the end. Birth and death are connected to each other like a ring, or some say a spiral. Some say a spiral that in turn forms a ring. Some ramble in agonizing longevity, but the basis is agreed upon. Like sleep, like death, you wake up again, whether you want to or not. This is why when we first meet Five Pebbles, he states, "You're stuck in a cycle or a repeating pattern. You want a way out. Know that this does not make you special. Every living thing shares that same frustration, from the microbes in the processing strata to me, who am, if you excuse me, godlike in comparison." In reality, an entire video can be made on the Great Cycle and its effects on the world of rainworld, but that is for another time. In direct response to this unwanted and torturous immortality, they would become absolutely obsessed with breaking the Great Cycle, and permanently ending their lives to whatever means they could. In their efforts, they founded a religion that focused on freeing themselves from what was called the 5 natural urges. The iterator murals were actually made to depict the 5 natural urges. The first one depicts violence or wrath. The second one depicts lust. The third one depicts materialism or attachment to the material world. The fourth one depicts gluttony. And the last one depicts ego or self-worth. It was thought by the ancients that if one could shed all 5 of the natural urges, they could break the Great Cycle. They thought that shedding these urges would allow them to ascend, or stop the cycle of life and death. But breaking the Great Cycle would be far more difficult than the ancients ever thought it out to be. Eons before any Slugcat existed, the world would have been a very frigid place. The same climate that is experienced during Saint's campaign. The earliest eras in the ancients' history are shrouded in mystery, to say the least. The only glimpses of their early history we get are from various surviving documents and structures throughout the game. Let's focus first on one structure in particular that you are likely quite familiar with. Shaded Citadel. The structure itself is described by Moon as a temple, where the early ancients' masks were made by a material known as bone plaster and created by monks. In other words, Shaded Citadel would have been a very old religious site, where early masks were created. But there is a slight catch to this. She also describes that old industrial religious sites, such as Shaded Citadel, were remodeled and incorporated, meaning Shaded Citadel is likely a restored or remodeled version of an actual ancient religious site. But let's focus more on these early bone plaster masks. We only ever see the more modern masks of the ancients, the ones that were very lavish and golden. However, there is the case of the elite scavengers. They wear unique masks that look like modified vulture masks, and they very well could be. But if we take one of them to Moon, she states, "I honestly can't tell what this is. It's light but strong. Appears to be some composite material interwoven with bone. It seems to have been deliberately altered from its original form, with noticeable fragments that are melded together. Perhaps an archaeological relic of some civilization's work. I wish I knew more, because this is likely a valuable find." Could these masks be the ancient bone plaster masks worn by the ancients, or at least a modified version? Not even the iterators seem to know. Moving on to some of the oldest texts in the game, they mainly describe various pieces of art and literature, poems, hymns, paintings, rituals, and festivals. The earliest ancients seem to be well known for their artistic capability, but there are two other documents from this time that stand above the rest. They give us insight into what the early ancients thought of the Great Cycle, and perhaps shows a more darker side to them. They compared the world to a tangled rug, an unfortunate mess, or a fishing net, because the more you struggle and squirm, the more entangled you become. They say that only the limp body of a jellyfish cannot be captured or tangled in a net, so we should try to be like the jellyfish, because the jellyfish doesn't try. It's a small plate, a little text of spiritual guidance. It's written by a monk called 4 Cabinets, 11 Hatchets. It's old, several ages before the revolution. Like most writing from this time, it's quite shrouded in analogies, but the subject is how to shed one of the 5 natural urges which tie a creature to life, namely number 4, gluttony. It is basically an instruction on how to starve yourself on herbal tea and gravel, but disguised as a poem. This was an eternal dilemma to them. They were burdened by great ambition, yet deeply convinced that striving in itself was an unforgivable vice. They tried very hard to be effortless. Perhaps that's what we were to them, someone to delegate that unrestrained effort to. In truth, no amount of spiritual guidance or starvation would allow the ancients to break the Great Cycle. They struggled to become the limp body of the jellyfish, to become effortless. It seemed there was no end to their suffering. That is, until they started drilling. So down into the depths you go as many others before you, drawn to the void again and again, an endless drip, drip, drip. Much like these tunnels and caves that amuse me so, the bones of forgotten civilizations, heaped like so many sticks. Do they dig too deep, or not deep enough? Fools, we were right to drill straight through them. It is unknown why, but at some point the ancients began drilling into the earth. We can see these ancient drill sites in both subterranean and pipeyard, where pipeyard was exclusively created for drilling and early extraction purposes. Oh, interesting. This is a diary entry of a pre-Iterator era laborer during the construction of the subterranean transit system south of here. In it, they describe restless nights filled with disturbing dreams, where millions of glowing stars move menacingly into distance. What they discovered deep below the surface was truly revolutionary. An underground ocean of a golden fluid, a yellow sea with unknown origins. It became known as the Void Sea, or perhaps more commonly, the Void. If you drill far enough into the earth, you begin encountering a substance called void fluid. The deeper you go, the less rock and more void fluid. It's believed that there is a point where the rock completely gives way. Below that would be the Void Sea. Void fluid had many anomalous and unique properties that no other material on the earth possessed. But slowly, the ancients would study this golden fluid and discover the true nature of it, where it would change the world forever. My creators, or rather my creators' ancestors, figured out a way to use void fluid. By creating a vacuum of empty space and inducing a flux in the energy fields around the singular node point. Well, it's basically impossible to understand the actual process, but all you really need to know is that the ancients found a way to exploit the void fluid. They were able to harness it into a near limitless source of power and energy. and thus began the Void Fluid Revolution. As Moon simply puts it, the early ages of the Void Fluid Revolution were an explosive period of innovation and industry. You could think of it as the Industrial Revolution, only more intense. It basically jump-started the Ancients from an early steam age to an age of technological innovation. The only remnants that almost certainly existed during the early ages of the Void Fluid Revolution were the remains of outer expanse. In fact, we get hints of their early industrialization from the networks of pipes and industrial structures we can see. It was also presumably around this time that the Ancients gained the ability to manipulate the genome at will. They began to create what was known as purposed organisms, biologically altered or even manufactured creatures, or microbes. They were designed to serve or benefit the Ancients' needs. By the time we play as any Slugcat, it is very likely that every creature we encounter is the result of a purposed organism. In other words, there were no natural creatures left. Slugcats themselves were likely purposed organisms, although it is unknown what purpose they were supposed to serve. In general, the Void Fluid Revolution seemed to push the Ancients away from their more traditional beliefs. They seemed to undergo a sort of scientific revolution. But there is one very important property of Void Fluid I haven't mentioned yet. You see, it could not only be used to create immense amounts of energy, but used as a tool for destruction, or rather, elimination. This is a very early research journal, equating Void Fluid to antimatter. While that comparison works metaphorically, it fundamentally misunderstands the true nature of the fluid. There is a reason this early ancient scientist compared Void Fluid to antimatter, even if it's incorrect. In physics, if antimatter were to interact with normal matter, that is, if they touched, the result is annihilation. They cancel each other out. Void Fluid, when interacting with any kind of matter, had a similar effect. It could dissolve any material it touched. It could dissolve people and erase them, ascend them. This discovery was perhaps the most revolutionary out of everything. It gave the Ancients a way out, a simple way of ending their lives and breaking the Great Cycle. Of course, when Void Fluid was discovered, these methods proved obsolete, as it was more easy just jumping in a vat of it to effortlessly leave this world behind. So, presumably, the religious practices of becoming effortless died down, because why would you attempt to starve yourself and suffer even more if you could just dissolve away in the mysterious fluid? Assuming you were rich and had access to the Void Fluid, of course. However, it would prove to not be so simple. For many, there were severe consequences for attempting to leave the world behind through the Void Sea. There were some horror stories, though, that if your ego was big enough, not even the Void Fluid could entirely cross you out, and a faint echo of your pompousness would grandiosely haunt the premises forever. These beings became known as the Echoes, the spiritual remnants of past Ancients, who are indefinitely trapped between our world and another. They are the individuals who attempted ascension, but still clung to one of the 5 natural urges. An angry fool I was, blinded by fervor and pride. Now here I linger, chained to the memories of a city I once struggled to escape, bound by recollections of those who I could not leave behind. You have no name. I once had. I was embalmed, adorned, readied for the journey. So proud. There was jubilation. My name was sung loud and clear. Did they know that I didn't quite leave, didn't quite stay? Should I be ashamed that I linger here where my memories are kept? Should I be ashamed that I now envy your flesh prison? So even when the Void Fluid baths became cheaper, some would still starve and drink the bitter tea. Maybe it was ego, their so-called gift to the world. Maybe it was out of desperation, their fear of becoming trapped between 2 worlds. Maybe they couldn't be bothered to find a solution to the Great Cycle, so they transferred the burden to someone else. No matter the reason, the Ancients, with their newfound technology and power, began constructing huge megastructures of enormous scale. Giant supercomputers vastly more sophisticated and advanced than ours. Sapient supercomputers. They were known as the Iterators. Part biological and part machine, they were designed by the Ancients specifically for one thing, for one task that went by many names. Some called it the Big Task, the Big Problem, or the Great Problem, but they all refer to the same thing, the task of finding a solution for Ascension, finding a way to erase oneself without the use of the Void Sea, finding a way to break the Great Cycle. They were all tasked with finding the triple affirmative. Affirmative that a solution has been found, affirmative that the solution is portable, and affirmative that technical implementation is possible and generally applicable. In essence, they were tasked by the Ancients to find a simple way to ascend every being onto Earth, where it was referred to as global ascension. They were even created to be part machine and part biological, so that the Great Cycle applied to them too. The Ancients even went as far as to forbid them from ceasing function, or dying. It was programmed into their machinery, I suppose as a cruel way of motivating them. We toiled away at a great problem passed down to us from our creators, debating, testing, calculating, researching. Thousands of us. We assemble work groups, we ponder, we iterate and try. Some of us die, it's not fair. Because there's not any options. You have no more than two alternatives, do nothing, or work like you're supposed to. An analogy, you have a maze and you have a handful of bugs. You put the bugs in the maze and you leave. Given infinite time, one of the bugs will find a way out, if they just erratically try and try. This is why they call us Iterators. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about the beginning of the Iterator era, especially in the context of the Ancients. Looks to the Moon was definitely one of the first Iterators turned online, but she hasn't shared too many details about her early history. I exist as an old model, and the concept of an Iterator was still fairly new at the time of my construction. Knowledge of the technology, and more importantly its limits, had not quite reached maturity. She also mentions how the caravans in Outer Expanse were used as an early method to transport materials between Iterators, and connected them together. And she briefly mentions that at the time she came online, very little primal fauna were left alive, meaning, as I mentioned earlier, most creatures left were purpose organisms. 5 Pebbles actually gives us a few small details of the early Iterator era, because even though he was built much later on, he is much more fond of early history than Moon is. The first Iterators during the golden age of the Void Fluid Revolution lived through the metamorphosis of scripture and verse into the first age of understanding. He mentions how Moon was built on a large canyon that was rich in resources, but our consumption of water withered the surrounding environment away. And this brings up a very important point. The Iterators consumed vast amounts of resources in order to operate, namely 2 resources in particular, water and void fluid. In fact, filtration system and the facility routes have been constructed for these purposes, pumping water or void fluid to the Iterators, although it is unclear when exactly they were built. Void fluid was used as a primary power source for the Iterators, while water was mainly used to flush out byproducts of their processes. But that in itself would create one huge byproduct, steam. In the early stages of the Iterator era, the steam output would have warmed the climate, and made the planet, or at least the surrounding area, much more tolerable. But this wouldn't last for long. As the number of Iterators increased, so did the amount of steam that was pumped into the atmosphere. It became oversaturated because of the Iterators breathing. With too much steam being pumped into it, the result was nothing short of an ecological disaster. massive rainstorms to begin to clash against the landscape. Moon's rain siren was meant to warn those on the surface of the approaching rain. As the surface became battered by the rain, the ancients would build another huge structure in response. A giant retaining wall was built around Moon, and presumably other iterators. Essentially, it was a huge base plate meant to hold and reinforce the ground together, and prevent damage from the rain. It's as if they turned the ground into a giant slab of concrete. The ground beneath us is like an artificial mountain, with a layer of clouds that covers it. Within the retaining wall, various industrial structures and factories were built, many of which you are probably very familiar with. Most of them were built to be automated, and to be extremely resistant to the rain. Outskirts was likely a combination of suburban and industrial structures. Industrial complex is actually kind of interesting. It was a facility which produced spiritual items, such as masks for the ancients, the more lavish and golden ones we know today. It is confirmed that the real name of industrial complex was Sidehouse. Shade Citadel would have been connected to Sidehouse, and as I mentioned earlier, served as a religious site to fulfill religious obligations for the facility. When the production was automated, it would generally remain on the same site, so that the old stones could radiate the material of holiness, I suppose. It might be better to call it Unshaded Citadel though, because it would not have been shrouded in darkness at this point. Waterfront facility was an aquifer built by the ancients that collected rainwater and funneled it back to Moon's structure. Continual cycles of rain from our operation forces the water into small localized pockets around the nearby terrain. The aquifer was meant to consolidate these distributed water systems and funnel their contents back into the canyon. Drainage system was likely used as its name suggests, to drain runoff water. But it is also connected to filtration system, so it could have something to do with void fluid too. Farm arrays were, well, what the name suggests. They likely produced food. In this period of history, the ancients still lived on the surface. What is unclear is whether they still lived in outer expanse, or moved within the retaining wall. They likely did both. But soon enough, they wouldn't have much of a choice on where they could live. The rain would continue to get worse as more iterators were turned online. It became more powerful and intense, even deadly. Simply living on the surface was no longer an option. By now, living on the surface is laughable. We are across the river and have kicked out the boat. The surface beyond the facility walls is a sea of mud, ruins, and thick plant life. The ground out there is almost like water, and few things remain stable. Ancient structures uncovered by fissures, only to become buried again. But where could they go if the entire landscape was drenched in rain? The answer was above the clouds. Because of the sheer scale and enormity of the iterators, they were tall enough to be safe from the rain and steam output. The ancients would evacuate from the surface and build their cities on top of the iterators. Luna, the city on top of Looks to the Moon, was definitely one of the first cities built. Designing the surface world to be largely self-sufficient was a very deliberate decision, allowing my creators to live carefree lives up in their cities in the clouds. The few that rejected living above those clouds could only choose to venture as far into the expanse as they could. There were rumors that you could see the sky if the fog became thin enough. I wonder if those rumors were true, or just optimistic stories. Most of the ancients moved above the clouds, but this in itself seemed to sort of fracture their society. Scaling any iterator reveals just how far away each city was from each other. This, combined with a lack of physical communication, would have caused the ancients to form their own communities in each city. This is why their history becomes much more localized, We get less of the bigger picture because we cannot visit any other ancient communities or iterators. They're too far. So it becomes hard to generalize each colony and city the ancients split off into. They likely each held different beliefs, policies, and structures. But in general, each city seemed to follow a specific government system. They had what was known as a council, where different groups of ancients, known as the houses, would have a seat. Some also had someone with the title Grand Master of Cabinet, which seemed to be the general leader or president of the ancients. One iterator described the bleak conditions in their city. There was one particular Grand Master of Cabinet, 7 clouds above endless canyons, who was quite abrasive in his indoctrination. To him, his beliefs were absolute and non-negotiable. Those who strictly upheld the systems of his teachings were treated to the greatest luxuries of literature, art, and architecture. However, those who did not were damned to the worst living conditions imaginable. It was a particularly dark time for my colony. It's also worth mentioning that the transition from the surface to the cities seemed to give mixed feelings to the iterators, to say the least. None of us really missed the times when their cities were populated. Imagine having skin parasites that also ask for advice and have opinions. The relationship I had with my creators was a mutually symbiotic one. I was built to provide for them, but there was also much I relied on them to provide for me. Their absence has made things harder. Well, I guess thinking back on it now, there never was a dull moment while my citizens were around. But let's focus more on the ancients who lived on Luna, or on top of looks to the moon, since we know much more about them. In general, the city inhabitants seem to become much more spiritual. Not as much as their pre-Void Revolution ancestors, but enough that their society had notable religious organizations that had some political power. They still used the Void Sea to ascend, but it was only reserved for the most rich and influential members of their society. The subterranean transit system would have almost definitely been used to transport them, but trips to the surface were extremely rare and treacherous. It was also probably around this time that the ancients built the infamous memory crypts, storage for the memories of ascended ancients in Shaded Citadel. The memory crypts were considered sacred ground by my creators. The memories and wealth of entire family houses were laid to rest within, and their destruction or theft by surface creatures was considered abhorrent. As such, the crypts are guarded by extremely durable and aggressive purpose organisms. We only get a glimpse of one of these memory capsules. In this vessel is the living memories of 17 axes, 15-spoked wheel, of the House of Braids, Count of 8 living blocks, Counselor of 16. 17 axes, 15-spoked wheel nobly decide to ascend in the beginning of 1514-008, after graciously donating all earthly possessions to the local Iterator project, Unparalleled Innocence, and left these memories to be cherished by the carnal plane. The sordid memories and qualia include watching dust suspended in an array of sun, old age, eating a very tasty meal, young child, defeating an opponent in a debate contest, and being applauded by fellow team members, late childhood, early adulthood, and the list goes on. If it wasn't clear already, the ancients made some notable technological advancements during this time, such as with the purposed organisms. They were able to make more biomechanical ones, such as the Miros birds, king vultures, leviathans, and Myros vultures. Many of the more advanced ones were used to guard specific places for the ancients. They also created this as an ID drone. It was sort of analogous to a mobile phone. It was your pass into the city. It could display advertisements. And funnily enough, it could be used as a Hey Siri or Hey Alexa kind of thing. They also seem to be known for hosting massive spiritual festivals in the city. I'd say my inhabitants were quite obnoxious. They'd hold festivals and celebrations for arbitrary events practically every other cycle. We iterators were built for pragmatism, so it is an understatement to say that we were not known for our appreciation of beauty. But the sky sails and flight during the big festivals always filled my soul with emotion. But everything wasn't all well, at least for the ancients living on top of looks to the moon. Because she was one of the first iterators constructed, She wasn't exactly created for long-term use, and many mechanical failures would follow. Certain oversights were made in the long-term scalability and sustainability of some of my functions, and after some time my facility could no longer keep up with the supply demands necessitated for the life of my city's inhabitants. These problems would ultimately lead to the construction of one of the most infamous iterators, 5 Pebbles. Originally, iterator sites had to be carefully picked out because of their water needs. They had to be put next to large sources of water, such as an aquifer or river. But because of the increasing intensity and quantity of rain, later iterators could be placed almost anywhere. Originally, water supply was very important when placing iterators. Later, there would be the great equalizer. The fact that we breathe out as much vapor as we inhale water led to there being water available everywhere, and the latest few generations could be placed almost completely freely. 5 Pebbles was definitely one of the last iterators built, and he was a very unique iterator too. He was mainly built as a safe haven for the citizens on top of Looks to the Moon, who were suffering from the dwindling supplies. Many solutions were discussed, but ultimately my construction was the one settled upon, to provide a haven to the impoverished, and to remove burden from Moon, to give her the time she needed to fully recover. And because he was one of the latest generations, he could be built right next to Moon without any concerns for resources. His proximity to Moon was what made him unique. Iterators were almost always built far away from each other. But traveling on the surface would have been too dangerous to the Ancients, especially on a massive scale, even if it was just a short journey. This is why Moon and Pebbles were practically connected. They shared resources such as water, and even had bridges constructed between them to allow for the migration of Moon's citizens. These two bridges would become known as the Precipice. Solutions were being drafted to allow for a mass migration of citizens out of Moon City. With how inhospitable the surface had become, attempting to escort an entire city's populace across the ground over any length of distance would have been disastrous. These connecting bridges served as a high-altitude evacuation route that could facilitate safe transit from her city to mine. But 5 Pebbles' construction was extremely controversial in the ancient community, mainly due to his selected construction site. He was to be built above Shaded Citadel, a sacred religious site. His structure would block out the sun and shroud the temple in darkness. This of course deeply angered the ancient religious community, where many would call for the end of his construction, or demolition. They would begin to refer to 5 Pebbles as the Apostate Superstructure Abomination. We of the 592nd High Convocation of the True Annoyed Citadel do hereby demand with full force of law and religious doctrine an immediate end to the construction of the Apostate Superstructure Abomination. To place shadow upon the divine body of the True Annoyed Citadel is outrageous blasphemy, and cannot be tolerated, no matter the circumstances. Ultimately, these demands were ignored, and 5 Pebbles would be built. The Citadel would officially become covered in darkness. It would become Shaded Citadel. Most of the citizens from Luna were evacuated to 5 Pebbles' city, Metropolis, but many stayed behind in protest of 5 Pebbles' construction. His construction would remain the largest source of controversy and division among the Ancients for the rest of their existence. 5 Pebbles is our creation, and we have parental obligations towards him. As an iterator, he is also a gift of charity from us to the world. I therefore ask you to do anything in your might to stop the house. We both know which house, from further obstruction. They have less than 40 members on the council, but still tilt the spiritual discourse with our iterator in the direction that most obviously displeases him, and is hardly high held by anyone in the community either. We cannot risk this. It was also during this time that some of the last buildings and regions were constructed by the Ancients. Sky Islands, a garden and communications array. Chimney Canopy, the silent chimney stacks of 5 Pebbles' complex. The garbage wastes, the waste department created for 5 Pebbles. And of course the exterior in Metropolis, the structure of Five Pebbles himself, and his city where his citizens would have lived. And it is this region that we will focus on next. Even though it is one of the most interesting places in the game, Metropolis isn't really mentioned by the iterators themselves. They only ever describe its architecture. Older models had more traditional constructions, but newer designs began to use a mass-produced cellular build called living blocks. Each cell in these blocks has a different shell reflecting their purpose. Some of these units contain completely immobile organisms or machinery. Others are small dwellings for cleaners or messengers to rest. Other, much larger cells serve as residences and storage. So apparently the city on top of Moon had older architecture, while Metropolis is more modernized. They had different cells in each building which served a different purpose. This is why the buildings looked like blocks stacked on top of each other, and why some have different colors. But there was one particular building or region you encountered as Artificer that was quite unique. It was known as the 12th Council Pillar, the House of Braids. If you recall, the ancient who had their memories stored in the memory crypts, the only one we can read, was affiliated with the House of Braids. In fact, it states that they were the Grand Master of the 12th Pillar of Community, so 17 axes, 15-spoked wheel must have been the leader of this specific establishment. Maybe one of these portraits depicted them. The building itself obviously had political importance, but it may have had other uses too. The game files label many parts of it as a temple, such as LC Temple Gate and LC Temple Entrance. LC stands for Lost City, by the way. It also had many laboratories within it, where they seemed to experiment with different iterator technologies, such as gravity disruptors and inspectors, so who knows what this building was truly meant for. Besides the House of Braids, there is also atop the tallest tower. Scaling it, we can see the vastness of the city and the other cities on top of the other iterators. It is also the resting place for one of the trapped echoes. Metropolis itself is a very desolate place. There are only a few recognizable things that we can see abandoned or frozen in place. We can see the desolate city slums, a crumbled strip mall, empty streets with a frozen traffic light, the abandoned subways, and the elevators stopped in place. We can see the broadcasts of the final advertisements the ancients would have been displayed. Most of them seem to be actual products: shoes, drinks, 5 Pepsi, and other miscellaneous items. 3 of them are quite cryptic. We don't quite know what they are meant to be displaying. But there are 2 that stand above the rest. This one appears to be some sort of news broadcast, or commercial. It obviously has a gravity disruptor in the background. Maybe it had something to do with the iterators, or the laboratories. But this final advertisement is the most clear out of them all, and it is perhaps the most dark. It was an advertisement for the memory crypts, encouraging ancients to get their memories stored in the pearls before they were all supposed to disappear. There is one more quite unique piece of art left behind by the ancients though. Five Pebbles' music pearl, which he treasured deeply. We do not know who wrote it or when it was written, only that he describes it as an old keepsake from times long past, and encodes a recording of a short hymn that was popular among the inhabitants of my city. It is the only piece of music we can listen to that was written by the ancients. It would have been a piece of music played by the ancients in his city, before everyone vanished. Although our community is blessed with an ever-shrinking population, and we can almost glimpse that glorious moment when the last of us has joined our most admired peers, we must still, at all times, maintain good relations with our iterator. This is an official decree of cultivation sent from the 22nd Subsistence Council, ordering the Eastern Spoke Farm Array Administration to immediately harvest and process all viable crops, despite whatever misgivings they might have. These are the final operating logs of a transit control tower. They regulated the inbound and outbound traffic of shipments to and from our facility. This log shows the point at which the caravan suspended their final shipments, and became frozen in time as they remain now. It is obvious that at some point, something terrible happened to the Ancients that would cause them to suddenly disappear. All of their efforts would ultimately culminate into a single defining moment. Everything the Ancients had accomplished, thousands of years of science, culture, politics, and revolution would boil down to one single day. If there is one recurring theme with the Ancients, it was their obsession with the Great Cycle. It fueled nearly everything they did. Their religion focused on breaking the Great Cycle. Almost all of their architecture displayed the words or symbols which reference the Great Cycle. A lot of their artwork references the Great Cycle in some way. The iterators themselves, the Ancients' greatest achievement, were designed specifically to break the Great Cycle. Everything the Ancients did was connected in some way with the Great Cycle, and the day they all disappeared is no exception. Presumably, the last of the railcars of the subway system would depart for the last time, and become frozen as they are now. It would carry the last remaining Ancients to their demise. For you though, there is another way, the old path. Go to the west past the farm arrays, and then down into the earth where the land fissures, as deep as you can reach, where the Ancients built their temples and danced their silly rituals. This faithful day became known as the Global or Mass Ascension, and unfortunately, despite its importance, it is poorly documented, but there are some things we do know for sure. The Ancients' obsession with breaking the Great Cycle would finally catch up to all of them. It seems that almost all of them, collectively, couldn't stand living anymore. The last of the Ancients thought that giving up their life was the most noble thing to do. Our creators chose to abandon us, taking a gamble and vanishing from the world, leaving us behind to simply keep working on their problem. That was a long time ago. The old world and its relics should be allowed to finally rest. They would all systematically sacrifice themselves to the Void Sea, and it wasn't just the Ancients around 5 Pebbles and Looks to the Moon who did this. Every Ancient alive on the planet gave up their lives on the day of global ascension. Disturbingly, mass ascension did not seem to be optional. Giving up your life was required. It did not matter if you wanted to ascend or not. Rhinestones above shattered glass is one of the most tragic echoes, as they seemed to not want to ascend while they were alive, but were forced to. And now they are trapped forever between our world and another. Do you see the same as me? Beauty continuing to bloom even in a place long forgotten. I did not have the will to depart, nor the desire. Why did they always search for an escape, as if we were imprisoned? What offering from the void could usurp the gift of life already given? This moment right here, it is where we are meant to be. This was the ultimate fate of every Ancient. They dissolved into the Void Sea, and if they still clung to one of the 5 natural urges, they would become trapped as an echo. If they successfully ascended, their fate was unknown. The ancients ultimately left behind a world in ruin. They cared nothing more than finding a way to break the Great Cycle, to free themselves, even if it meant sacrificing everything. They left behind an ecological disaster, a world dominated by awful storms, unnatural landscapes, purposed beings, random gods, and the echoes. Behold this empty husk of a land, populated only by storms, ruins, and abominations. It wasn't always thus. I was once the count of 2 living blocks, esteemed by my peers. I had progeny. From within my vessel of flesh, I would perch upon this spot to observe the rising of the sun. Corporeal matters seem so distant now. Most have forgotten this place, but I remain. The ancients always thought of themselves as the superior beings. They thought that they were the ones entitled to ascension, and that ascending was the greatest thing one could do. Most of them probably thought of themselves as being the most important civilization on the planet, but this was far from the actual truth. It seems that there were only a few ancients who truly understood the bigger picture, and even fewer who actually cared. There is no doubt that other civilizations existed before the ancients to the ancients. The depths of Subterranean is one such example. It is heavily implied that the depths were originally built by a civilization that came long before the ancients. It is unclear whether the statues or guardians were built by the ancients themselves, or if they were already there when they started drilling into the earth. When Five Pebbles briefly mentioned the ancients, he might have actually been referring to some other distant past civilization. After all, the iterators seem to use the word creator to refer to the traditional ancients, not the word ancient itself. 2 sprouts, 12 brackets, and droplets upon 5 large droplets seem to be the only ancients who recognized the civilizations who came before them. The chatter of 1,000,000 voices long dead, the voices serving as a wave propagating throughout the annals of history, the bones of forgotten civilizations heaped like so many sticks, and the dawning of a new era for the next civilization to arise. But it was only a matter of time before they would be consumed by the Void Sea. This was the true cycle the ancients neglected to acknowledge. Their obsession with breaking the Great Cycle only made them forget how to truly live. The Void Sea and the Great Cycle consumed their minds. The ancients were not a unique or superior species. They were not more worthy than any other creature. They would all become one of the many civilizations who made the ultimate sacrifice and paid the ultimate price. They only paved the path for another civilization to rise up and continue the cycle. The iterators who were left behind were forced to consider these possibilities. They were forced to continue working on the great problem, even with their creators abandoning them. They were still bound to their task and unable to ascend. They were all left to rot inside of their cans. The current fauna will likely not have a use for, nor the ability to comprehend the solution, and will no longer be operational by the time another advanced civilization comes into being. So why exactly are we doing all of this? We were supposed to help everyone, you know, everything. That was our purpose, a great gift to the lesser beings of the world. When facing our inability to do so, we all reacted differently, many with madness. Some out there might still be trying. Communications have been bad for a very long time, and by now I suspect most of us are isolated like me, or connected only in small groups. I don't know how many of us are still alive at this point. By now I cannot imagine many of us desire to be. The ultimate fate of all the iterators is unknown. By the time we play as most of the Slugcats, their communication equipment has already deteriorated. All of the iterators became extremely isolated and lonely. This was a broadcast node long ago. It is in read-only mode now. The last transmission recorded is, "Hello? Is anyone still reading me?" It seems that without their creators, the iterators would slowly and painfully deteriorate. Most, if not all, seem to slowly succumb to desolation, anger, insanity, or physical decay. You stand upon our creation. I toiled away until my final breath, as did many of us through countless generations. Research, shipments, architecture, computation, politics, worship, revolutions. All for a heap of rusted metal steeped in a puddle of frozen water. I placed my faith into the hands of random gods. Now I must endure it to the end. The ancients were like the antithesis to us humans. We strive to find ways to extend our lives, to prevent old age. We fear death. Immortality would be a dream for many people. The ancients were the opposite. The Great Cycle cursed them with immortality. They did everything they could to end their lives, and put an end to the cycle. Their struggle to break free from their immortality shows us that the preciousness of life often lies in its finite nature. Their story reminds us that our limited time on Earth is what makes our human experiences so precious. So, maybe go touch some grass or something. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far into the video without me having to put on Subway Surfers, you have earned my utmost respect. This video took so long to make. This idiot really thought he could finish it in a few weeks. I will now forever have flashbacks if someone were to just mention the word ancient. Make sure to check out Jaga, because they are probably the only reason you clicked on this video. They make really good art on their Tumblr, which will be linked in the top comment or in the description. Also, I know that a lot of rainworld's lore is up to interpretation, especially when it comes to the ancients. So if you have any problems with the video, let me know so I can make corrections. I might make some sort of addendum video if stuff needs more clarification, but as of right now, I am dead inside. But anyways, thanks again for watching. I need some sleep.